What if the smallest acts of kindness, the ones you thought no one even noticed, were actually a test? A test to see who still had a good heart in a world that rewards the selfish. For Wesley Barton, a 34-year-old single father crushed under $47,000 in medical debt and faded dreams of becoming an architect, kindness was the only thing he had left that was truly his. The recipients were Doris Hensley and Thelma Atkins, two elderly women who shuffled into Miller's Diner every evening at exactly 6 p.m., settling into the same worn booth by the window like it was the only place in the world they belonged. Day after day, for nearly 2 years, Wesley greeted them with a tired but genuine smile, helped them with their coats, made sure Doris's chamomile tea was always hot and Thelma's Earl Grey was steeped just right. He walked them to their car when it got dark. He listened to their stories about gardens and grandchildren who never visited, expecting nothing in return. He simply thought it was the decent thing to do, the way you treat people when no one's watching. He had no idea that the quiet woman in the threadbare wool coat was a reclusive real estate billionaire, or that every smile, every "How are you feeling tonight, ladies?" every single act of kindness was being carefully recorded in a leather journal she kept hidden in her purse. Because on a cold Tuesday evening, Booth 7 sat empty. Wednesday empty. Thursday empty. And then, on Friday, the diner door swung open. But it wasn't Doris and Thelma. It was a convoy of black SUVs. 4 men in $1,000 suits. 2 women carrying leather briefcases, faces cold as stone. And they asked for Wesley Barton by name. His manager went pale. His hands started shaking, because what came next would either change his life forever or destroy everything he had left. This is the story of a man who once lost his wife, his dreams, and nearly lost himself, but never lost his kindness. And of 2 elderly women the world had forgotten, who spent their final years searching for proof that genuine goodness still exists. If you believe that small, quiet acts of love can change an entire life, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell, because every week, I share stories that remind us why kindness is never wasted. And now, what do you think happens when a struggling single father's name appears in the will of a stranger billionaire? And what happens when her ruthless nephew, a man in an $8,000 suit who's never worked an honest day in his life, decides that fortune belongs to him and declares war on Wesley? Let's begin. The alarm screamed at 5 a.m., and Wesley Barton's hand shot out from under the thin blanket before his eyes even opened. He couldn't afford to let it ring twice, couldn't risk waking Emma in the room next door, where she slept curled around a stuffed rabbit that was missing one ear and most of its stuffing. He lay there for exactly 3 seconds. That was the deal he made with himself every morning. 3 seconds to feel the weight of everything pressing down on his chest before he forced himself upright. 3 seconds to remember that his body ached in places a 34-year-old body shouldn't ache. Then he swung his legs over the edge of the mattress and planted his feet on the cold floor, because that's what fathers do. They get up. They keep moving. They pretend everything is fine until their children are old enough to handle the truth. The kitchen was dark when he shuffled in, and he kept it that way. Light meant seeing things clearly, and Wesley had learned that mornings were easier when everything stayed soft and shadowed. He filled the coffee pot with water, measured out exactly enough grounds for 1 cup. He'd calculated it down to the tablespoon to stretch the can through the month, and stood there watching it drip while his stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten since the half sandwich he'd grabbed during yesterday's lunch break. There was bread in the cabinet, eggs in the refrigerator, but those were for Emma. Everything was for Emma. He opened the kitchen drawer instead, the one with the broken handle that he kept meaning to fix, and stared at the stack of envelopes inside. Past due. Final notice. Urgent. Response required. The medical bills alone would take him 3 lifetimes to pay off. $47, 000 from Emma's emergency surgery 2 years ago, when her appendix had nearly ruptured and Wesley had signed every form they put in front of him without looking at a single number because his daughter was screaming and nothing else mattered. He closed the drawer quietly, the way you close a door on a room you can't bear to enter. "Daddy!" Wesley turned too fast, nearly knocking his coffee cup off the counter. Emma stood in the doorway in her faded pajamas, brown hair tangled from sleep, squinting at him with those big eyes that looked so much like Grace's that sometimes it physically hurt to meet them. "Hey, sweetheart." He forced the brightness into his voice like pushing a boulder uphill. "What are you doing up so early?" "I heard you." She patted over and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against his apron. He'd already put it on, a habit so ingrained he didn't even notice anymore. "Are you going to work?" "In a little bit. You go back to sleep. Okay? Mrs. Patterson will be here at 7 to take you to school." Emma looked up at him, and for a terrible moment Wesley thought she was going to ask why he always looked so tired, why he never ate breakfast with her anymore, why the other kids' dads picked them up from school but he never could. Instead, she smiled. "Can I have the egg with the runny middle today?" Wesley's chest tightened. "You can have whatever kind of egg you want, baby girl." She hugged him tighter, then released him and shuffled back toward her room, already half asleep on her feet. Wesley watched her go, and something in him cracked just a little more, the way a windshield cracks, slowly spreading outward from a single point of impact until one day the whole thing shatters. He left the house before the sun came up, driving his 2003 sedan with the cracked windshield and the passenger door that only opened from the outside. The engine made a sound he'd been ignoring for 3 weeks because he couldn't afford to know what it meant. Miller's Diner sat on the corner of Oakwood and Fifth, a relic from another era with its chrome-edged counters and red vinyl booths. Wesley had worked there for 6 years, long enough to know every crack in the linoleum, every regular's order, every spot where the roof leaked when it rained hard enough. He tied his apron tighter, poured himself into the rhythm of the morning rush, and disappeared. That was the trick, really, disappearing into the work, becoming nothing but hands that poured coffee and feet that moved between tables and a mouth that said, "How are you folks doing today?" with enough warmth that people believed he meant it. And maybe he did mean it somewhere underneath the exhaustion. Maybe that was the only part of himself he hadn't managed to bury yet. "Wesley." Rita's voice cut through the noise of clinking plates and the breakfast crowd. She was standing by the register, arms crossed, watching him with that look she got when she was about to say something he didn't want to hear. Rita was 58, built like a woman who'd spent her whole life carrying things heavier than plates, and she had a way of seeing straight through people that made Wesley uncomfortable. He walked over, already bracing himself. "Something wrong with table 6? Something wrong with you?" She kept her voice low. "You're burning out, honey. I can see it. You've dropped 2 orders this week. You forgot to clock out last Tuesday. And you look like you haven't slept since the Clinton administration." "I'm fine, Rita." "You're not fine. Nobody's fine when they're working double 6 days a week and still coming in early on Sundays." She softened, just slightly. "I'm not trying to get in your business. But you keep going like this, you're going to collapse in the middle of the dinner rush. And then who's going to take care of that little girl?" Wesley didn't answer. There was no answer. Rita knew it, too. She had 3 kids of her own, a mortgage that was always one payment behind, and an ex-husband who contributed nothing but excuses. She understood that sometimes burning out was a luxury you couldn't afford. She sighed and patted his arm. "Just take a breath once in a while, okay? Even machines need maintenance." The afternoon dragged. Wesley poured coffee, refilled sugar dispensers, wiped down tables and smiled at customers and checked the clock so many times it started to feel like a nervous tick. At 5:47 p.m., he caught himself glancing toward the door and realized with a strange flutter in his chest, what he was waiting for. The dinner crowd thinned. The light outside turned golden, then amber, then faded toward evening blue. And at exactly 6 p.m., the little bell above the door chimed. Wesley looked up. Two elderly women stepped inside, arm in arm, one in a threadbare brown coat, the other in gray wool with a green scarf wrapped around her neck. They moved slowly, carefully, the way people move when their bodies have started to betray them but their spirits haven't surrendered yet. And despite everything, the debt, the exhaustion, the weight of a world that never seemed to ease up, Wesley Barton smiled. A real smile, the kind that reached his tired eyes. Doris and Thelma had arrived. They always chose the same booth, 7th from the door, pressed against the window where the evening light came through soft and golden before fading into the purple of early night. Wesley had stopped thinking of it as just a booth months ago. In his mind, it had become theirs. A small kingdom of cracked vinyl and laminate tabletop where two women who had clearly seen too much of the world came to rest for an hour each evening. Wesley grabbed 2 menus out of habit, even though none of them would need them, and crossed the diner floor to greet them. "Ladies," he said, and the warmth in his voice surprised even him. "Right on time as always." Doris Hensley looked up at him with those sharp gray eyes that seemed to notice everything. She was the quieter of the two, more watchful, with white hair pinned back in a style that belonged to another decade and a brown wool coat so worn at the elbows that the fabric had gone thin as paper. She never complained about it, never mentioned the cold. But Wesley had noticed, back in January, the way she kept her hands wrapped around her teacup like she was drawing warmth from it, and he'd started bringing her refills before she had to ask. "Wesley, dear," Doris said, her voice carrying that particular softness of women who had outlived most of the people they loved. "You look tired tonight." "I always look tired, Mrs. Hensley. It's part of my charm." Thelma Atkins laughed, a bright, unexpected sound that made 2 customers at the counter turn their heads. She was Doris's opposite in almost every way. Louder, quicker to smile, with a round face that crinkled into deep lines when she was amused. Her gray coat was slightly nicer than Doris's, though Wesley had noticed the safety pins holding her purse strapped together, the careful way she counted out exact change at the end of every visit. Whatever money these women had, they weren't spending it on themselves. "Charm," he says. Thelma shook her head, still smiling. "You hear that, Doris? The boy thinks exhaustion is charming." "The boy," Wesley said, placing the menus on the table with exaggerated dignity, "is 34 years old and will take whatever compliments he can get." He didn't wait for them to order. He already knew. 22 months of evenings had taught him their rhythms better than he knew his own. Chamomile tea for Doris, steeped exactly 4 minutes, with a small dish of honey on the side because she liked to add it herself. Earl Grey for Thelma, strong enough to wake the dead, as she put it, with 2 sugars stirred in before it reached the table. A shared plate of the apple pie if it was fresh, nothing if it wasn't. They had standards, these two, hidden beneath their threadbare coats and their safety pin purses. Wesley returned a few minutes later with their tea, setting each cup down with the careful precision of someone who understood that small things mattered. "There we are. And Mrs. Atkins, I've been meaning to ask, how's that garden doing? You mentioned last week the tomatoes were giving you trouble." Thelma's face lit up. It was remarkable, really, how a simple question could transform a person. The fatigue fell away from her features, replaced by something that looked almost like joy. "Oh, Wesley, you remembered." She wrapped her hands around her teacup. "The tomatoes are stubborn as ever, but I think we've reached an understanding. I've started talking to them in the mornings. Doris thinks I've lost my mind." "I think nothing of the sort," Doris said, but her eyes were smiling. "I think you've always been exactly this strange. It's why I've kept you around for 60 years. 63 years, Thelma corrected. Don't shortchange our friendship, Doris. I won't stand for it. Wesley watched them settle into their rhythm. The gentle teasing, the comfortable silences, the way they seemed to communicate entire conversations with nothing but glances, and felt something loosen in his chest. This was why he looked forward to 6 o'clock. Not because the work got easier or because the tips got better, but because these two women reminded him that somewhere beneath all the exhaustion and debt and quiet desperation, there was still goodness in the world, still connection, still people who cared whether the tomatoes were stubborn. He was wiping down a nearby table when a memory surfaced, unbidden. Their first meeting 22 months ago, on a gray November evening when he'd been 3 weeks into the job and still learning which customers tipped and which ones didn't. They'd walked in just like they did now, arm in arm, dressed in coats that were clean but clearly old. Wesley had been the only server on the floor. The other waitress, a college girl named Bridget, had taken one look at them and suddenly found urgent business in the kitchen. They won't tip, Bridget had muttered on her way past. Old ladies never do, and those two look like they're counting pennies. Wesley had ignored her. He'd walked over, smiled, and asked if they'd like a table or a booth. Doris had studied him then, really studied him with those gray eyes that missed nothing. A booth, please. By the window if one's available. He'd seated them, brought menus, recited the specials even though he'd noticed the way their eyes skipped past the prices. When Doris had asked for just hot water with lemon, Wesley hadn't blinked, hadn't let his smile falter, hadn't treated them any differently than he'd treated the businessman in the expensive suit who'd ordered a steak and left a $20 tip an hour earlier. At the end of that first evening, Doris had caught his wrist as he cleared their cups. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Young man," she'd said, "why were you kind to us?" The question had caught him off guard. "I'm sorry. We're two old women in old coats who ordered the cheapest thing on the menu. The other girl wouldn't even look at us. But you," she tilted her head, examining him like he was a puzzle she was trying to solve. "You treated us like we mattered." Why? Wesley had thought about it for a moment. Really thought, because something in her eyes told him she'd know if he lied. "Because you do matter," he'd said finally. "Everyone who walks through that door matters. I don't know your story. Maybe you're having a hard month. Maybe you just weren't hungry. But you came in and you were polite, and you smiled at me when I brought your water. That's more than most people do." He'd shrugged, suddenly embarrassed. "I don't know. My mom always said you can tell a lot about someone by how they treat people who can't do anything for them." Doris had released his wrist. She'd looked at Thelma, something passing between them that Wesley couldn't read. "Your mother," Doris had said quietly, "raised a good man. They'd left a $5 tip on a $3 check. And they'd come back the next evening, and the next, and every evening since." Now, 22 months later, Wesley refilled Thelma's Earl Grey without being asked and caught Doris watching him again with that same unreadable expression. "What?" he asked, smiling. Doris shook her head slowly. "Nothing, dear. Just thinking about how rare it is to find someone who's exactly who they appear to be." Wesley didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded and moved on to the next table. Behind him, Doris reached into her purse and pulled out a small leather journal. She opened it to a fresh page, glanced at Wesley's retreating back, and began to write. 10 years ago, Wesley Barton had been a different man. He stood at the front of a lecture hall in a borrowed blazer, his thesis project displayed on the screen behind him, a community center designed for the Eastbrook neighborhood, where families lived 3 generations to a house and kids played basketball on courts with no nets. His hands were steady, his voice was clear, and somewhere in the back row, a woman with honey-brown hair and a belly rounded with 7 months of pregnancy, was smiling at him like he'd already won. "The problem with modern urban design," Wesley said, advancing to the next slide, "is that we've forgotten who we're building for. We design for efficiency, for profit margins, for people who can afford to care about aesthetic. But what about the communities that have been left behind? What about the neighborhoods where the nearest park is a 40-minute bus ride away?" The panel of professors watched him with varying degrees of interest. Dr. Whitfield, the department chair, had his pen poised over a notepad. Professor Elaine Goodwin, the toughest critic in the program, had actually uncrossed her arms, which Wesley knew from 3 years of her classes was practically a standing ovation. He clicked to the next image, a rendering of the community center, all warm wood and open spaces and floor-to-ceiling windows that would flood the interior with natural light, a rooftop garden, a playground designed with input from actual children in the neighborhood, a small business incubator on the second floor, a medical clinic tucked into the east wing. "This isn't just a building," Wesley said, and he could hear the fire in his own voice, the conviction that came from believing in something so completely that doubt simply couldn't find a foothold. "It's a statement. Says you matter. Your neighborhood matters. You deserve beauty and function and spaces that were designed with you in mind, not despite you." When he finished, there was a moment of silence that stretched just long enough to make his heart stutter. Then Dr. Whitfield set down his pen and nodded slowly. "Mr. Barton," he said, "in 23 years of teaching, I've seen perhaps 5 projects that made me remember why I got into this field in the first place. This is one of them." Wesley barely heard the rest of the feedback. He was looking at Grace, who had tears running down her cheeks and was mouthing 3 words that made everything else disappear. "I love you." After the presentation, she met him in the hallway, moving with that careful waddle that pregnant women develop when their center of gravity shifts too far forward. He wrapped his arms around her, or as much of her as he could reach, and pressed his forehead to hers. "You did it," she whispered. "Wes, you actually did it. We don't know yet. The committee still has to." "Stop." She put a finger to his lips. "You did it. I saw their faces." Dr. Whitfield looked like he was about to cry. "That man hasn't shown emotion since 1987. Wesley laughed, and the sound echoed off the linoleum floors of the hallway, bright and unguarded. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that. Couldn't remember the last time the future had looked so wide open, so full of possibility. "2 more months," he said, resting his hand on her belly. "2 more months and she'll be here, and I'll have my degree, and we'll figure everything else out." Grace covered his hand with her own. "We will. We always do." That night, they sat on the floor of their tiny apartment, too small for a proper dining table, too cramped for the nursery they were trying to build in the corner of their bedroom, and talked about the future. Grace worked as a librarian's assistant, a job she loved despite the modest pay. Wesley had already been approached by 2 firms about internships after graduation. The thesis project had generated interest from a community development nonprofit that wanted to explore actually building the center. "Imagine it," Grace said, her head resting on his shoulder. 10 years from now, our daughter running around that playground you designed. You standing there watching, knowing you built something that will outlast you. That's assuming anyone lets a broke kid from nowhere actually build something. They will." She said it with such certainty, such unwavering faith, that Wesley almost believed her. "Because you're not just talented, Wes. You're good. And eventually, the world catches up to good people." He kissed the top of her head, breathed in the smell of her shampoo. Something floral, something that would linger in the apartment for months after she was gone, until Wesley finally threw away the bottle because he couldn't bear it anymore. "I love you," he said. I know. She smiled against his shoulder. That's the only thing I've ever been completely sure of. 8 weeks later, Grace went into labor 3 days early. Wesley held her hand in the delivery room, coaching her through contractions, telling her she was doing amazing, that Emma was almost here, that everything would be perfect. Then the monitors started screaming. He remembered fragments after that. A nurse pushing him toward the door. Voices shouting medical terms he didn't understand. Someone saying aneurysm, and someone else saying she's hemorrhaging. And then a terrible, ringing silence that seemed to swallow the entire world. Emma was born at 3:47 a.m., healthy and screaming. Grace died at 4:12 a.m., her hand still warm in Wesley's when they finally let him back into the room. The funeral was 3 weeks later. Wesley's parents were already gone. His mother to cancer when he was 19, his father to a heart attack 2 years after that. His brother flew in from Seattle, stayed for 4 days, and then flew back to a life that didn't include room for grief or orphan nieces. The community development nonprofit sent flowers. Dr. Whitfield sent a card. Wesley dropped out of the architecture program 6 weeks after the funeral. He couldn't focus, couldn't design, couldn't look at blueprints without seeing Grace's face, hearing her voice saying, "You built something that will outlast you." The irony was too much. He had wanted to build things that would last. Instead, the only thing that would outlast him now was a daughter who would never know her mother. The night he made the decision official, he went into the backyard of the apartment complex. A patch of dead grass and weeds between the building and the parking lot, and built a small fire in an old metal trash can. He fed his portfolio to the flames 1 page at a time. Sketches he'd spent months perfecting. The community center renderings. Notes from professors. A letter of recommendation Dr. Whitfield had written calling him one of the most promising young architects I've encountered in my career. All of it turned to ash. When it was done, Wesley stood there watching the embers glow orange in the dark, and he whispered 2 words to no one. Or maybe to Grace. Or maybe to the version of himself that had died in that delivery room alongside her. "I'm sorry." Then he went inside, picked up his sleeping daughter, and began learning how to be a ghost. It happened on a Thursday evening, unremarkable in every way except for the small accident that would lodge itself in Wesley's memory and refuse to leave. The dinner rush had thinned to its usual evening lull, that quiet hour between the families finishing their meals and the late-night crowd trickling in for coffee and pie. Wesley was refilling the sugar dispensers at the counter when he heard the soft clatter from booth 7, the sound of something hitting the floor, followed by Thelma's frustrated sigh. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Thelma muttered, bending forward in a way that made Wesley wince. Women her age shouldn't be bending like that, reaching under tables for fallen things. Their bones were too fragile, their balance too uncertain. He was at her side before she could strain herself further, already lowering to one knee on the worn linoleum. "I've got it, Mrs. Atkins. Don't you move." The contents of Thelma's purse had scattered across the floor in a small constellation of everyday objects. Wesley gathered them quickly, cataloging each item as he placed it back in the bag. A peppermint wrapped in cellophane, its edges soft from living too long in the warmth of a purse. A folded tissue, clean but creased from being carried, just in case, for probably weeks. A set of keys on a ring shaped like a ladybug. Reading glasses in a case that had seen better days. A small leather wallet, thin enough that Wesley didn't let himself think about what that meant. And then his fingers touched something smooth. A photograph, face down on the floor, its edges worn soft with age and handling. Wesley picked it up carefully, the way you handle things that clearly matter to someone, and turned it over without thinking. 2 young women stared back at him, frozen in a moment from another lifetime. They stood on a beach somewhere, waves foaming around their ankles, their 1960s-style dresses billowing in what must have been a strong coastal wind. One wore a floral print, yellows and oranges that seemed to glow even in the faded photograph. The other wore solid blue, simple and elegant. Their arms were linked, their heads thrown back in laughter, and they looked at the camera, at whoever was taking the picture, with the kind of uncomplicated joy that comes only from youth, from not yet knowing how much the world can take from you. Wesley stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile these vibrant young women with the elderly figures sitting before him in their threadbare coats. "That's us," Thelma said softly. He looked up. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between sadness and tenderness, memory and loss. "Summer of 1962, she continued. "Virginia Beach. We just graduated from nursing school, and we thought we knew everything." A small laugh escaped her. "We knew nothing, nothing at all. But we were so sure of ourselves, Doris and I, so certain that the world was ours for the taking." Wesley looked at the photograph again, then at Doris, who was watching him with those quiet, observant eyes that always seemed to be measuring something. "You were beautiful," he said, and immediately felt foolish. "I mean, you're still. I didn't mean." "We know what you meant, dear." Doris's voice was gentle. "And you're right. We were beautiful. We were young. We had no idea that life was about to become very complicated, very quickly." She reached out, and Wesley placed the photograph in her palm with a care that surprised him. Doris studied it for a long moment, her thumb brushing across the faces of two women who no longer existed except in memory and faded images. "Before the world got complicated," Thelma said, almost to herself. "That's how I always think of it. Before the marriages, the children, the money we made and the money we lost, the husbands who left and the friends who died. Before all of it." Wesley stood slowly, the collected purse in his hands. He set it on the table beside Thelma, but he didn't move away. Something held him there, a gravity in the moment that he didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. "We've been rich, Wesley." Doris looked up at him, and there was something in her eyes now, something fierce beneath the softness. "And we've been poor. We've lived in penthouses and we've lived in apartments where the heat didn't work. We've worn diamonds and we've worn safety pins." Her gaze flickered to Thelma's purse, and Wesley understood that she knew he'd noticed. "And do you know what we learned? In all those years, in all those different lives." Wesley shook his head. "The only thing that ever mattered," Doris said, each word landing with deliberate weight, "was whether people saw us as human beings, not as bank accounts, not as opportunities, not as inconveniences to be shuffled past or ignored. Just human beings worthy of basic dignity and kindness." She held Wesley's gaze for a moment longer than felt comfortable, and he had the strange sensation that he was being tested, that these words meant something more than their surface, carried a weight he couldn't quite grasp. "I hope I always see people that way," he said finally. "I try to, anyway." Thelma reached out and patted his hand. "We know you do, dear. That's why we keep coming back." The rest of the evening passed in its usual rhythm. Tea refills, quiet conversation. Wesley walking them to their car when the sky grew dark and the parking lot emptied. But something had shifted. Some invisible thread had been pulled tighter, and Wesley felt it even if he couldn't name it. When he got home that night, the house was quiet. The babysitter, a retired neighbor named Gladys who charged far less than Wesley could reasonably expect and far more than he could comfortably afford, had left a note on the counter. Emma ate all her dinner. Homework done. Bath done. Asleep by 8:30. She's a sweet one. Wesley crept into his daughter's room, moving with the practiced silence of a parent who knew every creaking floorboard. Emma was curled on her side, one arm wrapped around the stuffed rabbit, her breathing slow and even. He stood there watching her for a long moment, thinking about photographs and young women on beaches and all the ways life could change between one heartbeat and the next. "Daddy!" Her voice startled him. He'd been so sure she was asleep. "Hey, sweetheart." He knelt beside her bed, brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "I didn't mean to wake you." Emma's eyes, half-lidded with sleep, studied his face with a perception that always unsettled him. Children saw things. They noticed what adults tried to hide. "Why do you look sad?" she asked. Wesley felt something tighten in his chest. The photograph, Doris's words, the ghosts of all the lives they'd lived before landing in booth 7 of a worn-down diner. "I'm just tired, baby," he said, forcing a smile. "That's all. Long day." She watched him for another moment, unconvinced. But sleep was pulling at her, and she was too young to have learned how to press when adults were lying. "Okay, Daddy," she murmured, her eyes drifting closed. "Love you. Love you too, Emma. More than anything in the world." He stayed there until her breathing deepened again, then slipped out of the room and into the quiet of a house that still felt too empty, no matter how many years passed. In the kitchen, he opened the drawer with the broken handle, looked at the stack of bills, closed it again. Then he sat at the table in the dark, thinking about two women who had been rich and poor and everything in between, and wondering what it must be like to have lived enough life to know what actually mattered. Tuesday, 6 p.m. The bell above the door chimed, and Wesley looked up with the automatic smile he'd perfected over 6 years of serving strangers. It was a young couple, early 20s, laughing about something on one of their phones. They slid into a booth near the front, oblivious to the way Wesley's eyes lingered on the door behind them, waiting for it to open again. At 6:05, he told himself they were just running late. Traffic, maybe, or Thelma's garden had needed last-minute attention, or Doris had misplaced her keys. She'd mentioned once that she was getting forgetful, though Wesley had never seen evidence of it. At 6:15, he refilled coffee cups he'd already refilled, wiped down tables that were already clean, and found excuses to pass by the window where he could watch the parking lot. At 6:30, booth 7 sat empty. Rita caught him staring at it and raised an eyebrow. "Your ladies not coming tonight?" "I don't know." Wesley heard the uncertainty in his own voice and tried to smooth it over. "They've never missed a Tuesday. Not in almost 2 years." Rita shrugged, already moving on to other concerns. "Maybe they had plans. Even old folks have lives, Wesley." He nodded, but something cold had settled in his stomach. Something that felt like the beginning of dread. Wednesday, 6 p.m. The booth was empty. Wesley had arrived at work early, though he couldn't have explained why. He'd prepared their usual order before realizing what he was doing. Chamomile tea steeping in the pot, Earl Grey ready to brew, 2 cups set aside on the counter like offerings to gods who might not show. The bell chimed at 6:03, and his heart leaped. But it was just old Mr. Patterson from the hardware store 2 blocks down, shuffling in for his usual slice of meatloaf and complaints about the weather. By 6:45, Wesley had given up pretending he wasn't watching the door. "They'll come tomorrow," he told himself as he poured the untouched chamomile down the drain. "They'll come tomorrow and have some perfectly reasonable explanation, and I'll feel foolish for worrying." Thursday, 6 p.m. The booth was empty. Wesley stood behind the counter, hands gripping the edge until his knuckles went white. 3 days. 3 days without Doris's quiet observations and Thelma's bright laughter. 3 days without the only part of his shift that felt like something other than survival. He found Rita in the back, sorting through a delivery of napkins and ketchup bottles. "Rita, has anyone called? For me, I mean. Or maybe asking about the diner." She looked up, frowning. "Called? No, hon." "Why?" The two older women, Doris and Thelma. They haven't been in since Monday, and He stopped, unsure how to explain the weight pressing on his chest. I'm worried about them. Rita's expression softened. She set down the box she was holding and gave him her full attention, which was rare enough that Wesley knew he must look as worried as he felt. Maybe they're traveling, she offered. Or one of them caught a cold. It happens, Wesley. People have lives outside this diner. They would have said something. They always told me when they had appointments, or when Thelma's sister was visiting from out of town. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated by his own inability to articulate what he knew in his gut. Something's wrong. I can feel it. Rita was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and squeezed his arm. You've got a good heart, she said. Too good, maybe. But there's nothing you can do except wait. They'll either come back or they won't. That's how it works with people, honey. They come and go, and we don't always get to know why. Wesley nodded, but the words didn't help. They rattled around inside him, hollow and insufficient. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the photograph of two young women on a beach. About Doris saying the only thing that ever mattered was whether people saw you as a human being. About the leather journal she sometimes wrote in when she thought he wasn't looking. He thought about all the evenings he'd spent pouring their tea and listening to their stories, never once asking for their phone numbers or addresses, never once thinking he might need to reach them. They had existed in the bubble of the diner, and he had somehow convinced himself that bubble would last forever. Friday, 6 p.m. Wesley stood at his station, barely breathing. The minute hand on the diner's old clock seemed to move through molasses. Every time the door opened, his head snapped up. Every time it wasn't them, something inside him cracked a little more. At 6:12, the door opened. 4 men walked in. They were wrong for the diner in every possible way. Tailored suits in charcoal and navy, shoes that probably cost more than Wesley made in a month, faces carefully composed into expressions of professional neutrality. Behind them came two women, equally polished, carrying leather folders pressed against their chests like armor. The diner fell quiet, not completely silent. Forks still scraped against plates, and someone in the back was coughing, but the energy shifted. Everyone felt it, the intrusion of something that didn't belong. One of the men, silver-haired with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite, scanned the room with cool efficiency. His gaze landed on Wesley, and something flickered there. Recognition, maybe, or confirmation. We're looking for Wesley Barton, he said. His voice carried easily, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard. Rita stepped forward, positioning herself between the strangers and her staff with an instinct that Wesley would remember later with gratitude. Who's asking? The man didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on Wesley, who stood frozen behind the counter, a coffee pot still clutched in his hand. Mr. Barton, the man said, ignoring Rita's question entirely. My name is Evelyn Pritchard's associate. We're with Whitmore and Associates, attorneys at law. We need to speak with you regarding a matter of some urgency. Wesley's hands started shaking. The coffee pot trembled in his grip, and he set it down carefully before he could drop it. Attorneys, suits, urgency. This was about Doris and Thelma. It had to be. And whatever had brought these people here, whatever had kept that booth empty for 4 days straight, it wasn't going to be good news. Is this about the Hensley account? One of the women murmured to her colleague, flipping open her leather folder. Hensley. Doris Hensley. Mr. Barton. The silver-haired man took a step closer. I understand this is unexpected, but I assure you we mean you no harm. There are matters that need to be discussed. Matters that will significantly affect your future. Wesley looked at Rita. Her face had gone pale, and she was staring at the men like they might pull out weapons at any moment. He looked at booth 7, empty and waiting for women who would never sit there again. He looked at his hands, still trembling at his sides. And then he heard himself say, in a voice that didn't sound like his own, "What happened to them? What happened to Doris and Thelma?" The silver-haired man's expression shifted, just slightly, just enough. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "we should sit down." The conference room at Whitmore and Associates smelled like leather and money and something else Wesley couldn't identify. Maybe the particular scent of lives being rearranged, of futures being rewritten in legal ink on expensive paper. He sat in a chair that probably cost more than his car, hands folded on a mahogany table so polished he could see his own reflection in its surface. The man staring back at him looked shell-shocked, pale, still wearing his faded blue apron because no one had thought to tell him to take it off before they ushered him into the black SUV outside Miller's Diner. Evelyn Pritchard sat across from him, a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in an elegant twist and eyes that held the particular steadiness of someone who delivered life-altering news for a living. She had a folder open in front of her, documents arranged with precise care, and she waited with patient silence while Wesley tried to remember how to breathe. "Mr. Barton," she began, her voice gentle but professional, "I want to first express my sincere condolences. I understand that Mrs. Hensley and Mrs. Atkins were important to you." Wesley nodded. His throat felt like it had been filled with sand. "Doris Hensley passed away peacefully in her sleep 5 days ago," Evelyn continued. "She was at home, in her own bed, surrounded by things she loved. The doctors believe it was her heart. She'd had a condition for several years, though she refused most treatment. She was—" A small smile crossed Evelyn's face. "She was a stubborn woman. She wanted to go on her own terms. 5 days." Wesley counted backward. That meant she died the same night he'd found the photograph on the floor. The same night she'd told him that the only thing that mattered was being seen as a human being. She'd gone home after their chamomile tea and Earl Grey, after he'd walked them to their car in the dark parking lot, and she'd never woken up. "And Thelma?" The words came out rough, scraped from somewhere deep. Evelyn's expression shifted, something sadder creeping into her professional composure. "Mrs. Atkins passed 2 days later. Heart failure, according to the medical examiner, though." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Though I think we both know that's not the whole story. They'd been friends for over 60 years. Some bonds, when broken, simply can't be survived." Wesley thought about the photograph. 2 young women on a beach, laughing, their whole lives stretching out before them. 63 years, Thelma had said. "Don't shortchange our friendship." He should cry. He knew he should cry, but the tears wouldn't come. They were trapped somewhere behind a wall of shock so thick he couldn't feel anything at all. Just numbness. Just the distant awareness that 2 women who had mattered more than he'd realized were gone. And he hadn't even known. He'd been refilling sugar dispensers and worrying about bills while they were being lowered into the ground. "The services were private," Evelyn said, as if reading his thoughts. "Per Mrs. Hensley's instructions. She didn't want a fuss. But she did leave very specific instructions regarding you, Mr. Barton." Wesley looked up. "Me?" Evelyn slid a document across the table. Then another. Then another. Wesley stared at them without comprehension, the legal language swimming before his eyes like a foreign alphabet. "Mrs. Hensley has left you $750,000 in liquid assets," Evelyn said, her voice steady, almost clinical. "Additionally, you are now the owner of a portfolio containing 12 commercial properties throughout the city, currently valued at approximately $18 million. The numbers didn't register. They were too large, too impossible. They existed in a universe that had nothing to do with Wesley Barton and his cracked windshield and his stack of past-due notices hidden in a kitchen drawer. There's also the matter of the Hensley Foundation, Evelyn continued. Mrs. Hensley has left you controlling interest in the foundation, which currently holds an endowment of $45 million dedicated to community development and housing initiatives. Wesley heard himself laugh. It was an ugly sound, sharp and disbelieving. This is a mistake, he said. This has to be a mistake. Doris wore a threadbare coat. Thelma's purse was held together with safety pins. They ordered the cheapest things on the menu. He stopped, his mind catching up to what his mouth was saying. They were testing me. This whole time, they were testing me. Evelyn's expression confirmed what he already knew. Mrs. Hensley was a very private woman, she said carefully. She inherited considerable wealth from her late husband, Leonard Hensley, who made his fortune in commercial real estate during the 1970s and 80s. After his death, she became something of a recluse. She distrusted people, Mr. Barton. She'd learned the hard way that money attracts a certain kind of attention. Wesley thought about the leather journal, the way Doris watched him when she thought he wasn't looking, the questions she asked, casual but probing, about his daughter, his hopes, his past. She found you, Evelyn continued, almost 2 years ago. She told me she wanted to know if there was anyone left in the world who would be kind without expecting anything in return. And apparently, Mr. Barton, you passed her test. Wesley pressed his palms flat against the table, trying to anchor himself to something solid. $18 million. $45 million in an endowment. He couldn't even visualize those numbers. They were abstractions, fantasy figures from a life that belonged to someone else. I can't accept this, he said. This should go to her family. She must have family. Something shifted in Evelyn's expression. A shadow passed across her professional composure. She does have family, Evelyn said. One living relative. Her nephew. The conference room door opened. Wesley turned, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The man who entered was perhaps 52, 53, with the kind of silver-gray hair that suggested expensive styling and the kind of face that suggested expensive everything else. His suit was charcoal, perfectly tailored, probably worth more than Wesley's annual salary. His shoes gleamed. His watch glinted. Everything about him spoke of wealth and power and the absolute certainty that both belonged to him by right. But it was his eyes that made Wesley's stomach clench. Cold, calculating. The eyes of someone who viewed other people as obstacles to be removed or tools to be used. Gerald Hensley, Evelyn said, and her voice had gone flat, carefully neutral. I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow. Plans change. Gerald didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on Wesley with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. He took in the faded apron, the tired eyes, the trembling hands, and his lip curled almost imperceptibly. So this is him, the charity case who wormed his way into my aunt's good graces. Wesley stood. He didn't know why, instinct, maybe, or the refusal to be looked down upon while sitting. I didn't worm my way into anything. I didn't even know who she was. Of course you didn't. Gerald's smile was thin and sharp, a blade disguised as courtesy. And I'm sure you had no idea she was worth millions when you were pouring her tea and walking her to her car and playing the devoted servant. I'm sure this is all a complete surprise. It is. Gerald laughed. A cold, dismissive sound. Save the act for the courtroom, Mr. Barton. You'll need it. He turned to Evelyn, and his voice hardened. This will is fraudulent. My aunt was clearly not in her right mind during her final years, and this man, he gestured at Wesley without looking at him, manipulated 2 senile old women for their fortune. I'll have every document examined. Every interaction investigated. Every. Mrs. Hensley was evaluated by 3 independent physicians in the months before her death. Evelyn interrupted calmly. All 3 confirmed she was of sound mind. Her wishes were documented extensively, with witnesses present at each signing. Gerald's jaw tightened. Then I'll find other grounds. Undue influence. Fraud. Something. He turned back to Wesley, and the hatred in his eyes was undisguised now. This is a mistake, Mr. Barton, and I'm going to fix it. Every penny, every property, every share of that foundation. It belongs to my family. To me. And I will spend every dollar I have to make sure that's exactly where it ends up. He straightened his already immaculate tie. Enjoy this moment, he said quietly. It won't last. Then he turned and walked out, leaving Wesley standing in the sterile conference room, wearing his faded apron, staring at documents worth $63 million, and wondering how kindness had just made him the target of a man who looked like he destroyed people for sport. Gerald Hensley moved with the speed and precision of a man who had spent his entire life learning how to destroy obstacles. Within 48 hours of their conference room confrontation, Wesley's world had been turned inside out. The first blow came Monday morning, a call from Evelyn Pritchard informing him that all assets from Doris's estate had been frozen pending a judicial review. Gerald had filed an emergency motion claiming substantial evidence of elder abuse and undue influence, and a judge with connections to the Hensley family had granted it without hesitation. The second blow came Tuesday afternoon, when Wesley walked into Miller's diner for his shift and found Rita waiting for him at the door, her face a mask of barely contained panic. "There's reporters," she said. "Out back. And more coming." "Wesley, what the hell is going on?" He didn't have time to answer before the first camera appeared. The story had broken that morning on the city's largest news website, complete with a photograph of Wesley in his apron. Taken, he realized with sick horror, through the diner window without his knowledge. The headline screamed in bold letters, "Diner worker accused of conning elderly billionaire out of fortune." The subheadline was worse. "Nephew claims aunt was manipulated by minimum wage waiter." The article painted Wesley as a predator. It quoted anonymous sources close to the family, describing how he had targeted 2 vulnerable elderly women, insinuating himself into their lives with calculated charm. It mentioned his debt, his private, humiliating debt, as evidence of financial desperation. It implied, without quite stating, that he had somehow hastened Doris's death. By Wednesday, the story had spread to 3 more outlets. By Thursday, it had gone local television. Wesley stopped going outside. The reporters found his apartment anyway. They camped in the parking lot, shouting questions through the windows whenever they spotted movement behind the curtains. They photographed Emma's school, prompting the principal to call Wesley with thinly veiled concern about the attention their family was attracting. They dug up his past: architecture school dropout, wife deceased, living paycheck to paycheck, and presented it all as evidence of a man with nothing to lose and everything to gain. At Miller's diner, customers began to stare. Some whispered behind their hands. Others confronted Wesley directly, their faces twisted with righteous anger on behalf of a dead woman they'd never met. "You should be ashamed," a middle-aged woman spat at him while he tried to take her order. "Preying on little old ladies. People like you make me sick." Wesley said nothing. What could he say? The truth sounded like exactly the kind of excuse a guilty man would make. Rita pulled him aside at the end of his shift on Thursday, her expression torn between sympathy and self-preservation. "I'm not firing you," she said quickly. "I want to make that clear. But maybe you should take some time off, just until this blows over. The other customers are getting uncomfortable, and I've already had 2 regulars say they won't come back while you're here." Wesley nodded. He understood. He hated it, but he understood. That night, He came home to find Emma sitting on the front steps of their apartment building. Her knees pulled up to her chest, her face streaked with tears. Wesley's heart stopped. He knelt down in front of her, his hands shaking as he reached for her shoulders. "Emma? Baby, what happened? Why are you out here? Where's Mrs. Patterson?" "She's inside." Emma's voice came out in hiccups, broken by sobs she was trying desperately to control. "She said I should wait for you." She didn't know what to say. "About what?" "Emma, talk to me. What happened?" Emma looked up at him, and the pain in her eyes was so raw, so confused, that Wesley felt something crack open in his chest. "I was at Lily's house," she whispered. "Her mom had the news on, and they were talking about you, Daddy. They said you stole money from old ladies. They said you were a bad man." Her face crumpled. "Lily's mom made me leave. She said I couldn't play there anymore." Wesley pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, feeling her small body shake with sobs. "Are you a bad man, Daddy?" The words were muffled against his shoulder, but they hit him like physical blows. "Did you do what they said?" "No." Wesley's voice came out fierce, cracked with emotion he could no longer contain. "No, baby, I didn't. I promise you. I would never." He pulled back, cupping her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me. Those women on the news don't know me. They don't know what really happened. Doris and Thelma were my friends. Real friends. They left me something because they wanted to, not because I asked them to. And there's a man, a very powerful, very angry man, who's trying to take it away by telling lies about me." Emma's lower lip trembled. "But everyone believes him." "Not everyone." Wesley pulled her close again, his hand cradling the back of her head. "Not the people who matter. Not you. Not me. And I promise you, Emma, I'm going to fix this. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to prove that everything they're saying is wrong. Okay?" She nodded against his shoulder, her sobs slowly quieting. "Okay, Daddy." They sat there on the steps until the sky grew dark, Wesley holding his daughter, making promises he had no idea how to keep. The knock came at 11 p.m. Wesley opened the door to find Evelyn Pritchard standing in the hallway, her professional composure showing cracks of exhaustion. She held a manila envelope in one hand and something small and metallic in the other. "May I come in?" she asked. He stepped aside. Evelyn moved into the small living room, her eyes taking in the modest furniture, the crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, the stack of bills visible on the kitchen counter. She didn't comment. "Doris anticipated this," she said without preamble. "Gerald contesting the will, the media attacks, all of it. She knew her nephew better than anyone, and she knew exactly what he would do." She held out the metallic object. A key. Small, brass, ordinary-looking. "Storage Unit 14 at Parkside Self-Storage on Vine Street," Evelyn said. "Doris rented it 3 months before she died. She told me to give you this key only if Gerald went to war." A grim smile crossed her face. She called it her collection of evidence. Wesley took the key. It felt impossibly light for something so potentially important. "What's in it?" "I don't know exactly." She was very secretive about the contents. "But she said—" Evelyn paused, something flickering in her expression. "She said to tell you that she kept records, detailed records, of everything." Wesley thought about the leather journal Doris always carried, the one she wrote in when she thought he wasn't looking. "She also left you this." Evelyn handed over the manila envelope. "Instructions for what you'll find inside. There's a USB drive in the storage unit labeled specifically for you. She said you should play it when, and I'm quoting directly, when Gerald comes for you." Wesley stared at the envelope, then at the key in his hand. Doris had known. From the very beginning, she had known what her nephew would do, and she had prepared for it. She had armed Wesley for a war he hadn't even known was coming. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. Evelyn nodded. She moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at him. "Mr. Barton, I've practiced law for 27 years. I've seen people fight over fortunes, over properties, over things that didn't matter at all. But I've never seen anyone prepare for battle the way Doris did." She held his gaze. "Whatever's in that storage unit, it wasn't left there by accident. Use it wisely." Then she was gone, and Wesley was alone with a brass key, a manila envelope, and the first fragile spark of hope he'd felt since the world had started falling apart. The boardroom of the Hensley Foundation occupied the entire 32nd floor of a downtown high-rise, all glass walls and polished marble, and the kind of understated luxury that whispered old money louder than any display of extravagance could have screamed. Wesley stood outside the double doors, tugging at the collar of a suit that didn't quite fit, trying to remember how to breathe. The suit belonged to Rita's son, a young man named Derek who was taller than Wesley by 3 inches and broader by at least a size. The jacket hung slightly loose across Wesley's shoulders, and the pants had been hastily hemmed by Rita herself at 11 o'clock the night before. Her reading glasses perched on her nose as she muttered about stubborn men who didn't own proper clothes. "You go in there and you show them who you are," she had told him that morning, pressing the suit into his hands. "Not who Gerald Hensley says you are. Who you actually are." Wesley wished he felt as confident as she sounded. He pushed through the doors. The boardroom stretched before him like a battlefield, a massive oval table dominating the space, surrounded by 12 leather chairs occupied by 12 faces that turned toward him with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. Wesley recognized none of them, but he recognized the type, wealthy, connected, the kind of people who moved through the world with the assurance that came from never having worried about a bill in their lives. At the head of the table sat Gerald Hensley, immaculate in another perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair gleaming under the recessed lighting. He looked at Wesley the way a cat looks at a mouse that has wandered into its territory, already certain of the outcome. "Ah," Gerald said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Mr. Barton, so glad you could join us. Please, take a seat." He gestured to the chair at the far end of the table, the position of least power, the spot reserved for supplicants and subordinates. Wesley walked toward it, feeling every eye tracking his progress, his borrowed shoes clicking against the marble floor. He sat. He folded his hands on the table to hide their trembling, and he waited. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gerald began, rising from his seat with the practiced ease of a man who had commanded boardrooms his entire adult life. "We're here today to discuss the future of the Hensley Foundation, and specifically, the deeply troubling circumstances surrounding my aunt's final will and testament." He moved to a presentation screen mounted on the wall, clicking a remote that brought up a series of documents. "As you all know, my Aunt Doris was a remarkable woman, brilliant in her prime, dedicated to this foundation and its mission. But in her final years," Gerald's voice dropped into something resembling sorrow, though his eyes remained cold. "In her final years, I'm afraid she became vulnerable, confused, susceptible to manipulation by those who would take advantage of her generosity." He clicked to the next slide, a psychiatric evaluation official letterhead, damning conclusions highlighted in yellow. "This evaluation, conducted by Dr. Franklin Weiss, a respected geriatric psychiatrist, suggests that my aunt was exhibiting signs of cognitive decline as early as 18 months ago. Memory lapses, confusion about her finances, unusual attachment to strangers." Wesley felt his stomach clench. The evaluation looked legitimate. The language was clinical, authoritative. But something about it felt wrong, manufactured, like a weapon forged specifically for this moment. I've also gathered testimony from several individuals who interacted with my aunt during this period, Gerald continued, clicking through slides showing sworn statements, each one painting Doris as a woman losing her grip on reality. Her housekeeper, her personal driver, a neighbor who noticed her behaving erratically on multiple occasions. All of them confirm what the medical evidence suggests. Doris Hensley was not in a fit mental state to make decisions about her estate. He turned to the board, spreading his hands in a gesture of reasoned concern. And into this vulnerability stepped Wesley Barton. Gerald's voice hardened. A man drowning in debt. A man with every motivation to cultivate a relationship with a wealthy, isolated old woman. A man who spent nearly 2 years insinuating himself into her affections, positioning himself as the devoted servant while secretly angling for a fortune he had no legitimate claim to. Wesley wanted to stand, wanted to shout that every word was a lie. But his voice seemed trapped in his throat, paralyzed by the weight of the accusations and the knowing nods he saw spreading around the table. Gerald smiled, sensing victory. I move that this board reject the fraudulent provisions of my aunt's will, restore the estate to its rightful heir, and take immediate steps to remove Wesley Barton from any association with the Hensley Foundation. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. One board member was already reaching for a pen. Another was nodding along with Gerald's words as if they were gospel. Wesley stood. His legs felt unsteady, his hands still trembling at his sides. But he stood, and something in his movement made the room pause. You've presented a lot of evidence, Wesley said, his voice rougher than he wanted it to be. Documents and statements and evaluations. All very official. All very damning. He swallowed hard. But you've forgotten something, Mr. Hensley. Gerald's expression flickered, just for an instant, with something that might have been uncertainty. You've forgotten that Doris knew you. Wesley reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers closing around the USB drive he'd carried there like a talisman. She knew exactly who you were, what you'd do, and she prepared for it. He walked toward the presentation screen, his borrowed shoes clicking against the floor, and held up the drive. Before she died, Doris left this in a storage unit, with instructions that I should play it when, and these were her exact words, when Gerald comes for you. Gerald's face went pale. That's inadmissible. We don't know what's on that drive. It could be fabricated, manipulated. Then let's find out. Wesley plugged the drive into the port beneath the screen and pressed play. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered to life, and Doris Hensley's face filled the frame. She was sitting in a chair Wesley didn't recognize, in a room that looked like a private study. Bookshelves, warm lighting, a window showing afternoon sun. She was dressed simply, her white hair pulled back, her gray eyes sharp and clear and utterly, unmistakably lucid. If you're watching this, Doris said, her voice steady, then my nephew has done exactly what I expected him to do. He's contested my will. He's attacked the character of a good man. And he's tried to convince you all that I was some senile old woman who didn't know her own mind. She leaned forward slightly, and her gaze seemed to pierce through the screen directly into the boardroom. Let me be absolutely clear. I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of the contents of my will. Wesley heard Gerald shift behind him, heard the sharp intake of breath from several board members. I spent 2 years watching Wesley Barton, Doris continued. 2 years sitting in a booth at Miller's Diner, wearing my oldest coat, carrying a purse held together with safety pins. I wanted to see what he would do when he thought there was nothing to gain. When he believed I was just another old woman with nothing to offer. She smiled, and there was something fierce in it. He was kind. Every single day, without fail, without expectation, without agenda. He remembered how I liked my tea. He asked about Thelma's garden. He walked us to our car when it was dark because he worried about our safety. He treated us like human beings when most people treated us like furniture. Doris's expression hardened. Gerald, on the other hand, visited me twice in the last decade, both times to ask for money. He never once asked how I was feeling, never once inquired about my health or my happiness. He saw me as a bank account, not a person. She leaned back in her chair. This foundation was built to help people like Wesley, people who give when they have nothing left, people who believe that kindness matters even when no one is watching. If you side with Gerald today, you're not honoring my wishes. Her voice dropped to steel. You're spitting on them, and you're betraying everything this foundation was meant to stand for. The screen went dark. Silence filled the boardroom. Wesley turned to face the table, his heart pounding against his ribs. 12 faces stared back at him, their expressions transformed, doubt replacing certainty, shame creeping in where confidence had been. And at the head of the table, Gerald Hensley sat frozen, his mask of control finally irreparably shattered. The unraveling happened faster than anyone expected. Within hours of Doris's video playing in that boardroom, Gerald's carefully constructed case began to collapse like a house of cards in a windstorm. The psychiatric evaluation was examined by independent experts and found to contain irregularities, inconsistencies in the methodology, questionable conclusions that didn't match the raw data. Dr. Franklin Weiss, when pressed, admitted that he had been encouraged by Gerald to emphasize certain findings over others. The housekeeper recanted her statement. The driver refused to testify. The neighbor suddenly couldn't remember exactly what she had seen. The storage unit Doris had left behind contained more than just the USB drive. There were boxes of journals spanning 3 decades, meticulous records of every interaction she'd had with Gerald, the unanswered birthday cards, the requests for loans that were never repaid, the single visit during her husband's funeral that had lasted exactly 47 minutes. There were property records showing Gerald's attempts to pressure her into signing over assets. There were letters he'd written, cruel and dismissive, revealing the contempt he'd always hidden behind his polished veneer. Doris had been building her case for years, not out of paranoia, but out of the clear-eyed certainty of a woman who understood exactly what her nephew was capable of. 3 weeks after the board meeting, Gerald's legal team filed a motion to withdraw from the case. 2 days later, the court ruled definitively in Wesley's favor. The will stood. Every provision, every bequest, every carefully considered distribution of Doris Hensley's fortune was upheld. Wesley Barton, the diner worker who had poured chamomile tea and walked 2 elderly women to their car, was now worth $63 million. The reporters came back, of course. But this time their questions were different. Their tone transformed from accusatory to awed. They wanted to know what he would do with the money. Would he buy a mansion? Retire to some tropical island? Finally live the life of luxury that had been so unexpectedly dropped into his lap? Wesley's answer surprised everyone except those who truly knew him. He didn't move into a mansion. He stayed in the same modest apartment, though he did finally fix the heating system and replace the windows that let in drafts every winter. He didn't quit the diner, not entirely. He cut back his hours, but he still came in 3 times a week, still tied on the familiar apron, still poured coffee and asked customers how their days were going. The 12 commercial properties worth $18 million were converted, one by one, into affordable housing cooperatives. Wesley hired architects, good ones, the kind who understood that buildings should serve people rather than profit margins, and worked with them to transform cold investment assets into warm, livable homes for families who had been priced out of the city's housing market. The Hensley Foundation was renamed. It became the Hensley Atkins Community Fund because Wesley refused to let Thelma be forgotten. The endowment was restructured, its focus narrowed to 3 core missions: supporting single parents navigating impossible circumstances, providing medical debt relief for families drowning under the weight of healthcare costs, and offering small business grants to people with big dreams and empty pockets. Miller's Diner received a renovation, but Rita made sure it kept its soul. The chrome-edged counters were polished, not replaced. The red vinyl booths were reupholstered in the same shade of red. The old clock on the wall stayed exactly where it had always been. And 3 nights a week, the diner operated on a pay-what-you-can model, serving hot meals to anyone who walked through the door regardless of what they could afford. Wesley enrolled in online architecture classes. 10 years after burning his portfolio in a backyard trash can, he began to rebuild the dream he thought had died alongside Grace. The courses were challenging. He was older now, rustier, his mind slower to absorb new information than it had been at 24. But every night after Emma went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and his textbooks, and he studied. Because Doris had believed he was worth investing in, and he refused to prove her wrong. Emma turned 9 on a sunny Saturday in April. Wesley threw her a birthday party at the diner, her choice, not his, and invited every child in her class. The same children whose parents had whispered about Wesley behind his back now laughed and ran between the booths, their voices filling the space with exactly the kind of joy it had always deserved. After the party, after the cake and the presents and the gradual departure of sugar-crashed children, Wesley found Emma standing alone near the window, staring at a booth she had never paid much attention to before. Booth 7. A small bronze plaque had been installed there 2 months earlier, mounted on the wall just above where Doris and Thelma used to sit. Emma was reading the words etched into its surface, her lips moving silently. "Reserved for kindness," she said aloud as Wesley approached. "What does that mean, Daddy?" Wesley slid into the booth, the same seat he had watched Doris occupy hundreds of times. He patted the space beside him, and Emma climbed in, tucking herself against his side the way she had when she was smaller. "This was their booth," he said. "Grandma Doris and Grandma Thelma. They sat here every evening for almost 2 years." Emma looked up at him. What were they like? Wesley thought about how to answer, how to compress 2 years of chamomile tea and Earl Grey, of quiet conversations and gentle laughter, of lessons taught without words and tests passed without knowing. "They were wise," he said finally, "and kind, and they had seen enough of the world to know what really mattered." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "They taught me something important, Emma, something I want you to remember." "What?" Wesley looked around the diner, at the worn floors and the polished counters, at the window where evening light was just beginning to turn golden, at the plaque that honored 2 women who had changed everything by simply paying attention. "They taught me that the richest people aren't the ones with the most money," he said. "They're the ones who give the most of themselves, who are kind when no one's watching, who treat every person they meet like they matter, because they do." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she looked up at him with those eyes that were so much like Grace's, and she smiled. "Then you were always rich, Daddy," she said. "Even before the money came." Wesley felt something break open in his chest. Not the cracking he had grown accustomed to over the years, the slow fracturing of hope and energy and the will to keep going. This was different. This was release. This was 10 years of grief and struggle and barely surviving finally loosening its grip. He pulled Emma closer, pressing his face against the top of her head, and for the first time since Grace had died, he cried. Not from grief, not from exhaustion, not from the weight of bills and debt and impossible choices. From relief, because Doris had seen him. Thelma had seen him. Emma saw him. And somehow, against all odds, he had been enough. Not because of the money, not because of the properties or the foundation or the sudden transformation of his circumstances, but because he had been kind when it cost him nothing and everything at the same time. Because he had treated two women in threadbare coats like they were the most important people in the room. Because he had poured their tea and listened to their stories and walked them to their car in the dark, never once expecting anything in return. That was the true fortune. That was what Doris had tried to teach him all along. Kindness was never wasted. It was never unseen. It was the only currency that actually mattered in the end. And Wesley Barton, sitting in booth 7 with his daughter pressed against his side and tears streaming down his face, finally understood that he had been rich all along.
If this story moved you, subscribe and hit that bell. New stories every day that remind us kindness always matters. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, and drop a comment telling me what act of kindness changed your life. I'll see you in the next one.